I was 17 the first time I cooked supper for my family. I found that cooking could be a fun extracurricular activity. It was during a period in my life where I lacked the motivation to even get out of bed. I was a troubled young man with too much time on my hands, and my mother would beat me with a wooden paddle whenever I acted up around the house. She was a strict Christian type, a Jesus freak. She could spout biblical euphemisms until her cheeks turned blue. It was a toxic environment. My best friend Henry had joined the army the previous summer. Nobody else in my town would give me the time of day. This was before MySpace, and it may have been before computers were even invented. Sometimes it'd play a game I called Stick Mud, where it'd see how far I go. You'd mash a broomstick down into a sinkhole. Those were dark days. I'd usually just end up getting drunk on vodka out in the field. Pa had gotten me a paper route that summer delivering newspapers around town on my bicycle. It was fun, but my bicycle got stolen after my third week on the job. Pa sure was ticked off. I felt lucky he was gone most of the day out driving his school bus. But I'd always see him each night at the supper table. Ma was a terrible cook. She burned nearly every meal she'd ever prepared in her life. She'd boil down a mash of cabbage and flour into a thick stew, serving it in the same wooden bowl each evening. Her food made me sick. I never felt healthy growing up in her home. I was certain she'd been poisoning me ever since I was a baby. Pa was the serious type. He'd been a star athlete in secondary school. I was never able to escape his shadow. He tried his hand as a farmer and began driving the bus after I was born. Pa was a stoic man and had trouble communicating, but he'd always have enough energy to share his disdain of life with us each night at the supper table. I still remember his wrinkled face pulled into a permanent frown. I started learning to cook to kill the time. There was always so much time back then. I visited the public library and rented a couple cookbooks with no intention of returning them. We were poor, and I couldn't afford most of the ingredients, so I picked things up from the side of the road. I'd collect walnuts and wild strawberries for jams and preserves. I had set up my own kitchen out in the shed where I could cook and drink my vodka in private. Ma had agreed reluctantly to give me a few of her old pots if I started attending church again. I knew the pastor hated me, but I agreed and went anyway. I got a job flipping burgers from a man at the church. He was new to the area and had never heard of me or my family, which was a relief. He came to my house every day before work to pick me up. I enjoyed making the burgers and fries, and I think I became pretty good at it too. I'd hash out some recipes I'd seen in my books with the leftover ingredients. Soon I began stealing spices from the restaurant to bring home to Ma. She'd have had a heart attack if she knew her son was a thief, but I'd say they were gifts from my boss. She knew I spent long nights at the restaurant and I could save enough money to move out soon. There were fewer questions when the money was flowing and I could fund my own culinary experiments. It wasn't long before Ma was letting me cook supper all by myself. I could afford to get nicer food like pork much better than the sprigs from the garden. It was nice. Ma had a local Bible study with other women from our community and when they'd visited baked them some chocolate cookies. I'd stolen the cocoa and most everything else from the restaurant. The customers at the restaurant were some of the rudest people I'd ever met in my life, always complaining and asking for things. I knew most of the regulars though. There was Bob, the night manager at the petrol station, and Bob, a math teacher at the primary school. There was Judy and Frank, and Kevin and Tom. We lived in a small town, and almost everyone there had done me wrong at some point down the road. One time Pa had stopped by and I cooked him a burger on the house. It was the very first burger I ever spit on. He ate every bite and I realized this could be a fun new game for me. I began to enjoy gumming up the food more than I enjoyed preparing it. My favorite part was the look of innocence on the customer's face as they sucked down their tainted burgers and fries. They couldn't have been more clueless and they couldn't have seemed happier. One afternoon I found a rat that had drowned in a water bucket inside the utility closet. I decided to mash it into the burger meat. I tried picking out the grey tufts of fur and skin, but gave up and boiled the meat into the center of the patties. I figured most the fur would singe under the heat of the burner. I only got one complaint that entire day from an old man with his grandson. The boy had gotten choked on a small piece of bone. I had probably cooked 50 burgers contaminated with that soggy rat meat, and nobody seemed to notice a thing. I began to contaminate my family's supper as much as possible. I would add tiny bits of glass to my Ma's soups and watch in ecstasy as she slurped the bowl dry. She was asking me to cook more often, and she grew sicker and weaker by the day. When I would cook more and pour a meal, I mixed the most grotesque ingredients imaginable. Maggots were fairly easy to come across whenever I could score some decent roadkill. I'd seal the meat off in a plastic baggie and let it fester in the hot sun. The aging process added a unique taste, a sourness to the flavor profile that some people really seem to enjoy. By the end of the summer, my boss at the restaurant had grown tired of my antics. I'd been caught drinking on the job more than a couple times and customers were complaining about their food tasting rotten. I didn't care much. I had saved enough money to buy a pickup truck and was ready to move north. Ma had come down with a terrible case of pneumonia and Pa had to take off work to care for her. He cursed me for deciding to leave. I promised Ma and Pa I would cook them one last supper before I packed up and headed off for good. I was going to bake a fabulous dessert, a cherry pie. I had found some baby birds that had fallen from their nest and I wanted to incorporate them into the meal. They were covered in ants. I could just imagine Paul's face when he took that first bite. He might just gobble it down without even chewing, I thought. Ma had become too sick to walk, so she would have to eat her supper in bed. I mixed the crust following the instructions in my cookbook to the tea. I mixed the milk and sugar and layered the dough in a fresh tin. I didn't care much about the presentation, so long as they took that first gooey bite uninterrupted. I mixed the cherry filling in a separate bowl, taking time to whisk out the clumps of sugar and egg. I'd hidden the baby birds in a small bag underneath my bed. They were crusted and had to be worked loose with a set of pliers. I dropped them one by one into the cherry sauce. It dripped and bubbled as they sank slowly to the bottom of the pan. I weaved a decorative pattern over the top of the pie and placed it into the fire. It cooked to a golden brown, and I brought the pie into the house for supper. Pa couldn't wait to dig in. I cut 2 slices. I gave one to Pa and brought the other piece into Ma's bedroom. She was still sleeping, so I left her slice on the nightstand. That's when I heard Pa let out a blood-curdling roar that shook the walls of our house. "Oh, sweet Lord," he screamed. He was gurgling on his tongue, and I could barely make out his words. I ran back into the kitchen to see Pa straddling the floor. One of the baby birds was dangling from his mouth like a fishing lure. He had bitten the bird clean in half, and some of it was still stuck in his beard. He looked up at me, confused, unhinged. He began to puke, spraying blood and feathers across the room and onto the wall. Now, most children would have been horrified to see such a thing, but I felt pure and unadulterated joy. I felt the creativity and initiative I had shown throughout my culinary journey was something to be marveled. I laughed maniacally, pointing at the pie and then back at my paw. He was gripping his chest and gasping for air. I took the rest of the pie and smashed it over his head, and then I walked out the door. I never saw my ma or pa ever again. I have no idea what became of them. I'm much older these days and regret the way I treated people as a younger man, but I will never apologize for my actions. These days I own my own chain of burger restaurants which feeds thousands of people every day. I called it supper time. I tell my employees to wash their hands, but honestly I could care less.